Welcome to Harbor Point TV. This is a brand new version of our online service specifically designed with you in mind, with our weekend message and then space to respond in thought, reflection, and prayer in worship. Whether you're watching at home with family or amongst friends, listening to the podcast on your commute or even a run, our hope is that you might find and take your next step towards Jesus, whatever that might be. And in this new portable format, we invite you to share it with others. So to get more information, get connected, or to make a contribution, visit our website at harborpoint.church. This is Harbor Point TV.
Hey everyone, I'm Jeff McGuire. This is HPTV from Harbor Point Church in San Juan Capistrano, California. Great to be with you. Let me ask you a question, and just think about how you'd answer this question. What is the best, or in some cases, what's the right way to eat a plate of food? Now, some of you, maybe you know people like this, maybe this is you would say foods should only, except in extreme situations, always be kept apart. All foods should never touch. There should be no overlap. Maybe you know someone who's like this. Maybe you were one of those people who was like, my food is touching, if the whole plate is ruined. You're a person who believes that all dinners should be served like the classic hungry man dinner. I'm sure this is Salisbury steak, right? And you have every single food has its own particular little space, and never should the two meet. Some of you, by the way, who are food is touching people are like, there's an area right here where it appears to be some food. This whole thing should be thrown out. The whole thing is ruined. Everything's supposed to stay in their space, and sometimes they don't. And when food doesn't, it's gone. No food should ever overlap. Others of you say there's a good chance that some foods on a plate ought to overlap, like they necessarily go together. Like when you think about Thanksgiving, you're thinking about forming the perfect bite on a fork. All of a couple of flavors being put together should be experienced at the same time. And for the most part, though, foods do have a lane they should stay in, but occasionally they carpool. They get in the same fork, and that all works together. And there's another group of people who would say, look, all food on any plate is just a precursor to some version of a casserole. Here's a formal, actual casserole. This, by the way, is the most appetizing picture of a casserole I could find. I literally Googled the phrase beautiful casserole, and they all look incredibly disappointing. Anyway, nevertheless, some people, and you might be one of these people as well, who see the fork and the spoon given to you next to your plate as the instruments for blending and combining food so that all bites are some kind of really all sort of assortment of all kinds of flavors, a circus of flavors on every bite and every blending and combining, all that kind of stuff. Now, here's what we know. We know that there are some things that can easily, and maybe in some cases ought to be combined, and that there are some other things that get really, really tricky when they do get combined. Perhaps there is no more tricky two things to be combined than when it comes to Jesus and politics. Now, a couple of weeks ago, we started a series, and it was based on the simple idea that in survey after survey, Americans tend to have a really positive response to Jesus. They like the idea of Jesus, but they also tend to have very mixed emotions about a lot of the stuff that seems to be attached to him. In other words, people will often use the phrase, look, I like Jesus, but I'm not so sure about all the other things that apparently come with him. I mean, to look at Jesus' ministry early on, when people saw Jesus face to face, when they had the chance to get to see him face to face, often all Jesus would do was invite people to follow him, and they did. Here's what it says in Luke chapter 5. Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi, also called Matthew, sitting at his tax booth. Follow me, Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. And for a lot of people, what they tend to think is, if I could just get to Jesus without all this other stuff that's kind of attached to him, I might follow him also. Because trailing behind Jesus is all kinds of stuff. There's confusion and there's misunderstanding, there's conquest and colonialism, and there's dogma, and there's the confusing Bible, and then there's Jesus followers, and there's the institution of the church. And I think for a lot of people who think that they might like Jesus, one of the things they will say repeatedly that they have to figure out how to wade through to see if they really want Jesus, and this again might be you, is Jesus' relationship, or the relationship between Jesus and his followers and politics. More specifically, how they overlap. Now, here's a couple different ways which people believe how Jesus and politics should overlap. Number one is this. Some people say that Jesus and politics should never, ever overlap. They should be kept separate. They're the hungry man dinner kind of people who say, look, these two things should not ever touch. And if they do touch, they ruin each other. On the upside of this is that it keeps things incredibly neat and very tidy, that there's rarely confusion about what messages are Jesus kind of messages and what kind of messages are political messages, because each message has its own box and it's supposed to stay there. Now, the downside of this kind of thinking that they never overlap is this, that there are some things that probably should affect the other. And in fact, a faith kept too separate can't have the same kind of impact it was intended to maybe have. Then on the other end of the spectrum, there are people that say when it comes to politics and Jesus, they should always, always overlap. And these are people who would say, look, their belief is that the church is at its best. The church does its best work when it's manifesting or enforcing its influence over society in the political sphere, that this is where freedoms get protected, where rights get upheld, this kind of stuff, right? And the upside of this is this. Some of the great reforms in society, things like orphanages and leper colonies and hospitals and women's suffrage and universities and child labor laws were all accomplished because people said, look, we have to get the church involved in politics. And then the downside of this, though, is that occasionally there's some blurred lines between partisan politics and political agendas and the work of Jesus, and people who are looking at it kind of have some questions about it. Like, is this Jesus or is this something else? We're not sure when they're always interconnected. In fact, that's what a lot of people who are looking at Jesus, who are not sure about Jesus and politics, go, I'm not sure that's something I'm really too keen on. And then there's another group of people that's kind of the rest of the group. The rest of us would just say, well, yeah, Jesus and politics should overlap sometimes. Not all the time, not never, sometimes. These are people looking for that perfect kind of bite. And people who think there may need to be an intersection between Jesus and the political engagement kind of spheres, but we're just not sure where to go. I mean, the faith described in the Bible isn't just the private spiritual experience of people and their God, though that kind of thing existed in the first century. When we talk about the Bible, the faith described in the Bible is meant to be lived out with real world implications, and there has to be some kind, at least a little bit, of overlap with the political sphere. We just don't know where. So what do we do with this? First of all is this. Like all subjects, we do not claim to have all the answers. As a church, as a community, we're generally kind of wary of people who presume to have it all figured out. And so with that in mind, at this moment, we're going to do our best to aim at Jesus and to faithfully work out the rest of the stuff that might sort of come with it. But to engage in a conversation about a relationship with politics and relationship between politics and Jesus, I get that is incredibly fraught. So we're going to do that with great care, but we're going to start that conversation with Jesus and his own disciples. Matthew chapter 10, Jesus gives to his disciples essentially a laying out of the mission of what they're supposed to do. Here's what it looks like. It's kind of a daunting mission, but here's what he says. Matthew 10, verse 1. Jesus called his 12 disciples to him and gave them authority to drive out impure spirits and to heal every disease and sickness. Now, what you have to understand is basically, to sum it up, is he says, go to the most afflicted, the demonized and the sick, and bring healing and hope and restoration. Go to the most afflicted and give to them healing and hope and restoration. And then what Matthew will do is he'll list all of the apostles' names with a few little clarifiers attached to them. Verse 2. These are the names of the 12 apostles. First, Simon, who is called Peter, and his brother Andrew, and James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas and Matthew, the tax collector, James, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, and Simon the Zealot, and Judas Iscariot. So it lists off all of these people. Now, it just sort of seems like a kind of plain list, and I want to look at it just one layer deeper, perhaps, and maybe it gives us some clarification. Because we don't know a ton about these guys, but we do know some stuff. And here's some things to keep in mind. First is this. There's a couple different groups of people in Jesus' group, the most inner circle, that probably would have disagreed on a lot of different political spheres. Here's the first group of people. Peter, Andrew, James, and John. These are fishermen who own a business. Which means if you had to, and again, this is me interpreting some stuff, so you have to understand where I'm coming from. Business owners who work all night to catch fish. These are people who want to see the flourishing of private enterprise. They don't want the government and tax necessarily always jumping in, taking their resources, and they're not excited about all that stuff. They don't want to be. These are people who are already taxed heavily to support the Roman Empire and whatever else is going on there, and heavily could be ranging all the way up between 40 and 70% of their income could go to Rome. So these people are like, listen, I don't need a big government. I want a small government. Try to imagine where a couple of businessmen, just based on that information, would kind of align themselves with what political party. You get where I'm going. Then there's another guy in this group who self-identifies. He's the writer of this particular account of Jesus' life and ministry. His name's Matthew or Levi. He's a tax collector. This is an employee responsible for the collection of taxes, maybe even over these people themselves. It's possible, we don't know this, but it's possible that these fishermen, businessmen, would have encountered a guy like Matthew, if not Matthew himself, saying, look, oh, you guys did a great job catching all this fish. This is all going to Caesar. Feed your families and raise whatever, do whatever else you're going to do with the rest of your money, but I'm taking this and giving it to Caesar. This is a person who gets rich. This big government, in effect, is paying his own bills by taxing these kinds of people. He might be a person, based on his own particular kind of disposition, he might be a person who says, I like a big government, look what it does for me. And then there's another kind of person that's mentioned here, a guy named Simon the Zealot, who's an anti-government militant. The Zealots are a group of people who were all waiting for God's chosen rescuer, this person called the Messiah. They believed that that person would show up and immediately call all of God's people to take up a sword and stab a Roman and storm the castle gates and say, look, this is God's economy and God's people, and He's given us a military victory. These people are a take over Rome by whatever means necessary kind of people. Anti-Rome, anti-Caesar, and their belief in violence obviously was different than these two guys, or these two other categories of people. And we have to imagine that the likelihood that all of these people shared identical political ideologies is next to impossible. They would have been all over the map. We have to imagine if they were around today, they already would have unfriended and unfollowed and canceled each other because of the way that they saw their role and the way that they saw the government all pulled in together. Now, what's crazy is on more than one occasion, Jesus literally puts these people all in the same boat, and he gives them all the same mission. Go out to this mission of healing and hope and restoration for the people who are the most afflicted. They're going to have to, in that sense, reframe everything they know under the person of Jesus. All previous and differing kind of political opinions and loyalties all get subsumed under the person of Jesus. Now, bear in mind, when we start talking about politics, we start talking even about Jesus too, both Jesus and politics, they promise actually the same thing, no matter what political side you're talking about. The promise of politics and Jesus, they all promise the same thing, which is this. This is what they have in common. The promise of something called the good life, or the best kind of life. What you see when you start talking about politics is you always see there's the promise that says if you align with the party or a particular view or a person, you have a better shot at getting at this good kind of life. And the good life is what can or will be delivered to people by means of the political process. It's a kind of what you might call a utopian ideal. Now, Jesus had his own understanding about the good kind of life. And when he spoke about the good kind of life, he spoke about it in conjunction with something else. He spoke about it in conjunction with something called the kingdom of God. And as it's built, the whole kingdom of God is built on one particular a single unavoidable ethic that he gave to his disciples and the disciples with all their beliefs and loyalties and dispositions and everybody else who would follow Jesus later. The kingdom of God, Jesus would say, is built around these two correlated or interrelated statements, this singular ethic. And Jesus will say of these statements, look, all the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Everything you disciples knew before of the Hebrew Bible, which is what the Bible that Jesus had, all of it, the long and the short of it, hangs on these two things that I'm going to say, and they're interrelated. It says this, Matthew 22:37, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. Many of you have heard this many times. Secondly, it says this, and then the second is like it, meaning these two are necessarily connected. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love God, love neighbor. It's that simple. Now, the whole thing, basically this whole picture is this. That the kingdom of God, this good life, this version of what he was sometimes called the abundant life or the full life or the life that is life, the whole thing is built on the idea that loving your neighbor is necessarily an expression of what it means to love God. And Jesus will continually come back to this idea over and over again. And where it gets complicated is when people start asking, and Jesus does get asked this directly, well then who is my neighbor? Who's my neighbor? And to rephrase it more bluntly, it's this. Who am I obligated to care about? And even to say another way is this. Who can I justify not loving? Who's my neighbor, which means who am I obligated to care about? And who can I justify not loving? Now, in the first century, by the way, there's a lot of things we could think about. But for us right now, we could say, look, is my neighbor someone I know, someone I like, someone I agree with? Is it someone of the same political party? Is it someone who treats me well? In the first century, it would have been any fellow Jew that's in good standing with you and with the community. That's my neighbor. But Jesus keeps frustrating people as he keeps describing this idea. He keeps extending this idea of neighborliness and people that ought to be cared for and loved. He keeps extending it further and further outward. And the range of care and concern just kept getting wider and wider. It got so wide, Jesus even begins to say things like this. Here's what I want you to do. Bless and pray for your enemies. Show hospitality to strangers. It just gets crazier and crazier. And it's at that place where the political implications start to materialize a little bit. Inherent in politics, and all of you know this, inherent in politics is the business of enemy making, defining who the us's are and who the them's are. The them's, by the way, those are people who threaten our version of however we perceive it. Them's, the other people, they threaten our version of the good life. And when people threaten us, we start to feel fear. And as soon as we feel fear, we make those people that cause us to feel fear, we make them the enemy. We have anger and fear, all that other stuff that goes with it. So we have this great long kind of working out that says, look, I'm an us and you're a them. You know, that person said the buzzword that's attached to the thems over there. So now we know because they said that one word or that one phrase, now that's so politicized. We now know them and they're not us. They used to be us, but they said or did a thing or they're attached to a thing. They're not us. They're them. She can't be us because we're us and she's not us. And all of that kind of stuff goes on and on and on. And according to Jesus, that idea, all of our commitments to our political ideologies and our identity that's formed within that, all of that stuff ought to be resisted energetically. The idea of defining who's the us's and who's the thems. And what we have to thoughtfully call into question is this. What is it that's shaping my understanding of the us's and the thems? What is it that's shaping my understanding of the us's and the thems? Is it any one of these things? Is it Facebook? Is it Instagram? Is it Twitter? Is it the New York Times? Is it CNN? Is it the Wall Street Journal? Is it Fox News? The truth is, all of these different things present to us the us's and the thems and the enemies and the threats and the fears, and we're inundated by it over and over and over again constantly. We can't even escape it. And once we start listening to one thing, we get 100 other things that all agree with it, and they keep reiterating the same thing over and over and over again. And the truth is this. We cannot help but be formed in our thinking and in our practices and in our love but by the repetition of things we hear over and over again. We can't help but be formed by those things. If we keep hearing things over and over and over again, they can't help but to shape us. To say it differently, whatever we encounter repeatedly shapes us inevitably. Whatever we encounter repeatedly shapes us inevitably. Whatever we encounter repeatedly shapes us inevitably. What we experience then as familiar, because it gets repeated to us a lot, starts to be believed by us to be essential. And anything that we start to see as essential becomes something that we ought to love. That includes the version of the good kind of life that people are presenting to us on a regular basis. It includes who's a neighbor and who isn't. It includes the people who are with us. It includes all of those things that are people that are against us. And through all of that stuff, Jesus just simply says, love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Now, if the food on our proverbial plate, so to speak, if it's going to touch here at the intersection of me and whoever I deem to be my neighbor. That's the lens of our politics. And sometimes it requires something really heroic within us and from us. Because when we encounter someone who's called enemy or them or other, Jesus' people are still under the mandate to love those people. In fact, even more important in the Bible than the outward expression of worship, which there's lots of descriptions of kinds of worship that go on in the Bible, more important than the outward expression or the regular expression of what we might call worship practices, is something about caring for the people that belong to the category of people that Jesus will call the least of these, the oppressed, the afflicted. Here's what it says in Isaiah, and in the language is really harsh. Check this out. Isaiah chapter 1, verse 11. The multitude of your sacrifices, what are they to me, says the Lord? I have more than enough burnt offerings of rams and the fat of fattened animals. I have no pleasure in the blood of bulls and lambs and goats. Meaning, these are all things that are part of the regular practice of worship, and I don't want it anymore. I have enough of that. He keeps on going. When you come to appear before me, who has asked this of you, this trampling of my courts? Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations, these are all times when people would gather and worship. I can't bear your worthless assemblies. Your new moon feasts and your appointed festivals, I hate them with all my being. They've become a burden to me, and I'm weary of bearing them. Keep on going. It just gets even more harsh. When you spread out your hands in prayer, I hide my eyes from you, even when you offer many prayers. I'm not listening. Your hands are full of blood. Then he gives this solution. Wash and make yourselves clean, verse 16. Take your evil deeds out of my sight and stop doing what's wrong. In other words, these kinds of things are obscuring the worship that you intend to have. He says, instead, do this. Learn to do right, seek justice, defend the oppressed, take up the cause of the fatherless, and plead the case of the widow. Now, the people mentioned, like I said a minute ago, the people that are mentioned right here belong to a category of people that Jesus will call, though there'll be some other people that are added to it, that will call the least of these. And the Bible is unmistakable and undeniable in its bias for these kinds of people. The church historically has lived this out with great courage. In fact, one writer, a woman named Caitlin Sheese, who is brilliant, she wrote this book called The Liturgy of Politics. She says, here's the commission of the church, and she gives some examples. The church is commissioned to seek the flourishing of our communities, not special privileges for ourselves. She says, she gives an example from the early church. She says, in AD 112, Pliny the Younger wrote a letter to Trajan, the Roman emperor, in search of advice for dealing with Christians, these horrible people. He described the early church as an economic nuisance, as it had triggered a loss of revenue for the temples that sold sacrificial animals and other merchandise. He called them a political club. Now, just whatever you imagine a political action group, a political club might be, just put that in your head. And imagine, here's this horrible group of people acting as a political club, trying to organize or do some stuff or whatever you might imagine. Remember, this is a person writing about the problem of these Christians. And look at the horrible people, these Christians. Look what they're doing. They took care of the sick, organized community events, buried the impoverished dead, and supported widows and orphans. That's the nuisance, these horrible people, right? They're trying to figure out what to do with these people who did this kind of stuff. And in fact, the church was shaped by a dedication of upholding and seeking for the good of our marginalized and oppressed and vulnerable neighbor. Now listen really carefully. This is super important. That the church ought to be concerned with the least of these kinds of people was never in dispute. That the church should be concerned about widows and orphans, or in some cases it will include a group called the foreigners, that the church should be concerned with those kinds of people, that's not even in dispute. What is not laid out in the Bible is how exactly a 21st century person is supposed to engage those questions with regard to politics. Jesus doesn't lay out, here's exactly how this is supposed to be accomplished with regard to the political systems. He doesn't ever say that. So with integrity, you could talk about how a small government might do that the best, or how a big government might do that the best, or how one singular issue occupies your own understanding of whatever that might mean. Because at the heart of it, the goal is simply this, to place all other loyalties and other affinities, just like the disciples did, under the authority of Jesus and not the other way around, so that we might love our neighbor. Now, I'm going to give you 3 questions really, really quickly to wrestle with during this kind of season. And however you vote and whichever party you align with, I just want you to ask these questions in light of all the campaign promises, the good life, and here's the us's, and here's the thems, and the enemies, and all that kind of stuff. I want you to ask these questions. These are from Caitlin Sheese, the author of the book, The Liturgy of Politics, I showed you a second ago. Here's what she says. Brilliant questions. And that no matter, again, your political party or affiliation, who or what am I being told to fear, hate, or love? Who or what am I being told to fear, hate, or love? Just ask the question. Know that the political agenda is about creating us's and them's and creating fear and enemies and all that kind of stuff. Who am I being told to fear and hate and love? Just ask that question. You can identify what that is. You might agree with those kinds of things. I don't know, but just wrestle with that question. Secondly, What version of the promised good life is being presented to you? Every political party, every political idea, there's somewhere in all the politics is that promise. Work to identify what that promise is being made to you. What is being promised to me? And the third question connected to this. So first, who or what am I being told to fear, hate, and love? Number two, what version of the promised good life is being presented? And number three, this. Probably, basically, it's like 2B. How does that promise, the one being offered by this political party or message or political person, how does that promise align with Jesus' version of the good kind of life and love for neighbor? Who or what am I being told to fear, hate, or love? What version of the promised good life is being presented to me, and how does that promise align with Jesus' version of the good kind of life? Because in that sense, what we'll be able to say is I did my best to love my neighbor and I voted accordingly, or I operated accordingly. And that's where Jesus and politics ought to intersect. I'll leave you with this. It's a directive. It's a blessing in a sense given by the prophet, or given by God through the prophet Jeremiah to God's people who are in exile. And here's what he says about being in exile. Seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. To the city that is holding you captive, pray for it. Seek the peace and prosperity of that city. And if it prospers, you too will prosper. Whatever our approach and whatever our affiliation, might that be our goal. God bless you as you do so during this season.
As we take a moment of reflection through worship, how might Jesus' call to love your neighbor impact your role and opinions during this season?
I count on one thing, the same God who never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy. Oh my taste. Oh yes, I will. Oh yes, I will. I count on one thing, the same God who never fails will not fail me now. You won't fail me now in the waiting. The same God who's never late is working all things out. You're working all things out. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy. Oh my taste. Oh yes, I will. I'll choose to praise, to glorify name of all names. 'Cause 'cause nothing can stand against. I'll choose to praise. Oh, to glorify name of all names. 'Cause nothing can stand against. Oh yes, I will lift you high in the lowest valley. Yes, I will bless your name. Oh, yes, I will sing for joy when my heart is heavy. Oh, my taste. Oh, yes, I will for my taste. Oh, yes, I will for my taste. God, yes, I will. Oh, yes, I will. I'll choose to praise. I'll choose to praise.
Thank you for joining us. If you would like to reach out to a pastor to talk about some possible next steps, get information about attending or viewing one of our live gatherings, or to make a contribution, be sure to visit our website at harborpoint.church. Also, don't forget to take a look at the discussion questions on our website to help you keep the conversation going.